Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet one final time as she climbed into the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, and the familiar smell of jet fuel filled her nostrils. She had flown this particular aircraft, nicknamed Warthog by the pilots, dozens of times before, but today felt different. There was an electric tension in the air that made her hands slightly trembler as she ran through her pre-flight checklist. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence reports indicated that a small Taliban force had taken control of a remote village in the Kunar province, and coalition forces needed air support to clear them out. What wasn't mentioned in the briefing was the growing concern among the military leadership about the increasing boldness of enemy forces in the region. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was about to encounter something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As she taxied down the runway, Sarah thought about her journey to this moment. Growing up in rural Kansas, she had always dreamed of flying. Her father had been a crop duster, and she spent countless summer afternoons watching him maneuver his small plane through the sky with the grace of a dancer. When she announced her intention to join the Air Force and become a combat pilot, her family had been supportive, but worried. The year was 2010, and women in combat aviation were still relatively rare, especially in close air support roles like the A-10. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, and Sarah used the time to study the terrain below. Afghanistan's landscape was both beautiful and treacherous, with towering mountains giving way to deep valleys where enemy forces could easily hide. She had learned to read the land like a book, identifying potential threat locations and escape routes with the expertise that came from months of combat experience. When she reached the coordinates provided in her mission brief, Sarah began her initial reconnaissance pass. Flying at 15,000 feet, she used her aircraft's advanced targeting systems to scan the village below. What she saw immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. The intelligence had been completely wrong. This wasn't a small Taliban force holding a single village. Through her targeting pod, she could see hundreds of enemy fighters positioned throughout multiple compounds, with heavy weapons, vehicles, and what appeared to be a significant command structure. Sarah immediately radioed back to base, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Command, this is Hawk 7. I'm seeing a much larger enemy presence than briefed. Request updated intelligence and additional support." The response came back quickly, but it wasn't what she expected to hear. "Hawk 7, maintain current mission parameters. Proceed with original target engagement as briefed." The voice belonged to Colonel Davidson, a desk officer who had never flown combat missions but held significant influence over operational decisions. Sarah felt her jaw clench. She knew what she was seeing below, and it wasn't something that could be handled by a single A-10, no matter how capable. As she continued her surveillance, Sarah spotted something that made her blood run cold. In a compound on the eastern edge of the village, she could see what appeared to be prisoners. Through her targeting system's high-powered optics, she could make out figures in what looked like military uniforms, sitting in a courtyard surrounded by armed guards. The image quality wasn't perfect at this distance, but her training told her these were likely coalition forces who had been captured. Sarah tried the radio again. "Command, I'm observing what appears to be captured coalition personnel at grid reference 42 Sierra 785429. This changes the tactical situation significantly. I need immediate backup and rules of engagement update." The response was swift and uncompromising. "Negative, Hawk 7. No intelligence indicates captured personnel in that area. Proceed with original mission. That is a direct order." Sarah stared at her instruments for a moment, processing what she had just heard. Her training had drilled into her the absolute importance of following orders, especially in combat situations. The military chain of command existed for good reasons, and pilots who went rogue could endanger entire operations. But her eyes told her a different story than what command was willing to acknowledge. She banked her aircraft to get a different angle on the compound. Through her targeting pod, she could now clearly see that the figures in the courtyard were wearing digitized camouflage patterns consistent with U.S. Army uniforms. One of them appeared to be injured, with what looked like bandages around his head. Another was helping support him as they sat in the shade of a building. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could follow orders and engage the targets as briefed, potentially endangering the lives of captured soldiers. She could abort the mission entirely, but that would likely result in court-martial proceedings. Or she could take matters into her own hands and do what her training and instincts told her was right. The radio crackled again. "Hawk 7, what is your status? We show you holding position over target area." Sarah took a deep breath and keyed her microphone. "Command. I need to speak with General Morrison immediately. I have critical intelligence that changes this mission profile." There was a long pause before Colonel Davidson's voice returned, noticeably irritated. "Hawk 7, General Morrison is not available. You have your orders. Engage designated targets immediately or return to base." Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. Below her, she could see movement in the enemy positions. They had undoubtedly detected her presence and were beginning to take defensive measures. Time was running out, and she would have to make a choice that would define not only this mission, but potentially her entire career. She thought about the young soldiers who might be sitting in that courtyard, possibly wounded, definitely scared, and completely dependent on someone making the right decision. She thought about their families back home, waiting for news. She thought about her oath as an officer to protect and defend, not just follow orders blindly. Sarah switched her radio to a different frequency, one she knew was monitored by Special Operations Forces in the area. "Any Ranger or Special Forces units, this is Hawk 7 flying A-10 over Kunar Province. I have eyes on what appears to be captured U.S. personnel. Grid reference 42 Sierra 785429. Request immediate ground truth verification." The response came back within seconds. "Hawk 7, this is Ranger 6. We have a missing patrol that went dark 12 hours ago in your vicinity. 4 men. Can you confirm visual on personnel?" Sarah felt her heart rate spike. "Ranger 6, I have visual on 4 individuals in military uniforms being held under guard in enemy compound. One appears injured. I'm being ordered to engage targets in this area immediately." "Hawk 7, negative on any engagement. That's our people down there. We're moving ground assets to your location, but we need you to provide overwatch and prevent any harm to those prisoners." Sarah found herself caught between two conflicting sets of orders. Command was telling her to engage targets that would likely result in the deaths of American soldiers, while the Rangers were asking her to protect those same soldiers. There was no middle ground, no compromise position that would satisfy both requirements. The radio squawked again with Colonel Davidson's voice, now clearly angry. "Hawk 7, you are in direct violation of orders. Engage targets immediately or face court-martial proceedings." Sarah looked down at the compound below, where she could see the enemy fighters beginning to move the prisoners toward a building. If they got inside, any rescue attempt would become exponentially more difficult and dangerous. She had perhaps minutes before the situation became irretrievable. She made her decision. "Command, this is Hawk 7. I'm declaring an emergency tactical situation. I have confirmed visual on captured U.S. personnel and am taking action to prevent their execution. I'm engaging enemy forces around the prisoner compound only." Sarah rolled her aircraft into attack position, her targeting systems locking onto the guard positions around the courtyard where the prisoners were being held. Her 30mm GAU-8 cannon was capable of precision strikes that could eliminate threats while minimizing risk to the captured soldiers. but it would require flying close to the ground and exposing herself to enemy fire. As she began her attack run, Sarah knew that her career in the Air Force was likely over, regardless of the outcome. She was directly disobeying orders from her superior officers, engaging in unauthorized combat actions, and potentially triggering an international incident. But as she lined up her targeting reticle on the first guard position, she felt a clarity of purpose that she had never experienced before. The prisoners below had no idea that their salvation was screaming toward them at 400 miles per hour, piloted by a woman who had just sacrificed everything for their lives. Sarah's first pass over the compound was surgical in its precision. The A-10's massive 30mm cannon sent depleted uranium rounds tearing through the guard positions with devastating effect. She had calculated the angles perfectly, eliminating the immediate threats to the prisoners while avoiding any shots that might endanger the captured soldiers. The enemy fighters scattered like leaves in a hurricane, but Sarah could see through her targeting pod that the 4 American soldiers were still alive and had taken cover behind a low wall in the courtyard. The radio erupted with conflicting voices. Colonel Davidson was screaming orders for her to cease fire and return to base immediately, while Ranger 6 was providing coordinates for additional enemy positions and requesting continued air support. Through it all, Sarah maintained her focus. Banking her aircraft around for another attack run on the larger enemy force that was now mobilizing throughout the village. What she saw during her second pass made her stomach drop. This wasn't just a larger enemy force than intelligence had suggested. It was a major staging area for what appeared to be a coordinated attack on coalition bases throughout the region. She could see truck-mounted heavy weapons, ammunition stockpiles, and communications equipment that suggested a significant military operation was being planned from this location. Sarah keyed her radio to the Special Operations frequency. Ranger 6, this site is much bigger than we thought. I'm seeing heavy weapons, supply depots, and what looks like a command center. This appears to be a major enemy staging area. Copy that, Hawk 7. We're seeing increased radio chatter throughout the region. It looks like you stumbled onto something big. Can you maintain overwatch until our ground forces arrive? Sarah checked her fuel gauge and weapons status. She had enough ammunition for several more attack runs, but her fuel situation was becoming a concern. More importantly, she could see enemy vehicles beginning to converge on her location from multiple directions. Her unauthorized engagement had stirred up a hornet's nest, and she was now facing a much larger enemy force than any single aircraft should engage alone. Ranger 6, I can provide continued support, but I'm going to need backup soon. There are multiple enemy convoys moving toward this position. As if summoned by her words, Sarah's radar warning receiver began screaming. Somewhere below, the enemy had activated surface-to-air missile systems. She immediately began evasive maneuvers, deploying chaff and flares while scanning the sky for incoming threats. The A-10 was heavily armored and designed to survive ground fire, but SAM systems were a different level of threat entirely. A missile streaked past her canopy, close enough that she could see the exhaust trail. Sarah dove toward the deck, using the mountainous terrain to mask her approach as she searched for the missile site. Her training kicked in automatically: locate, identify, and eliminate the threat before it could fire again. She found the SAM launcher positioned on a ridgeline overlooking the village. It was a sophisticated system, probably supplied by foreign allies of the Taliban. Sarah lined up her attack run, but as she did, she noticed something that made her hesitate. The launcher was positioned directly adjacent to what appeared to be a school or clinic with civilian vehicles parked nearby. The rules of engagement were clear about avoiding civilian casualties, but Sarah was no longer operating under normal rules of engagement. She had already violated direct orders and engaged in unauthorized combat. Every decision she made now was entirely her own responsibility, with consequences that would extend far beyond this single mission. Sarah made a split-second decision to use one of her precision-guided Maverick missiles instead of the cannon. The missile would allow her to destroy the SAM launcher while minimizing the risk to nearby structures. She locked onto the target and fired, watching as the missile guided itself with deadly accuracy to its target. The explosion eliminated the immediate SAM threat, but Sarah knew that other systems were likely positioned throughout the area. Back at Bagram Air Base, the Situation Room was in chaos. General Morrison had been awakened from sleep and was now standing over a map table, trying to understand how a routine close air support mission had escalated into an unauthorized combat engagement involving captured American soldiers and a major enemy stronghold. "Sir, Captain Mitchell is refusing direct orders to disengage," Colonel Davidson reported, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "She's claiming emergency authority and continuing to engage targets without authorization." General Morrison studied the real-time feed from Sarah's aircraft. Despite his anger at the breakdown in command authority, he couldn't deny that what he was seeing on the screen was significant. The intelligence failure that had led to this situation was massive, and if Captain Mitchell was right about captured American soldiers, the political and military consequences of following the original mission parameters would have been catastrophic. "Get me a direct line to Captain Mitchell," the general ordered, "and get every available asset moving toward her position. If we have Americans on the ground in that area, we're going to get them out." Meanwhile, Sarah was fighting for her life. 2 more SAM systems had revealed themselves, and she was now flying through a complex web of surface-to-air threats while trying to maintain overwatch on the captured soldiers. Her aircraft had taken several hits from small arms fire, but the A-10's legendary toughness was keeping her airborne. Through her targeting pod, she could see that the enemy was attempting to move the American prisoners to vehicles, probably for transportation to a more secure location. If they succeeded in getting the soldiers into those vehicles, any rescue attempt would become exponentially more difficult. Sarah rolled into another attack run, this time targeting the vehicles that were approaching the prisoner compound. Her cannon fire turned the first truck into scrap metal, but the second vehicle managed to reach the courtyard. She watched in horror as enemy fighters began forcing the captured Americans toward the remaining truck. "Ranger 6, they're trying to move the prisoners. I need ground support immediately." "Hawk 7, we have fast rope teams and helicopters en route to your position. ETA 15 minutes. Can you prevent prisoner movement until then?" Sarah looked at her fuel gauge. 15 minutes was pushing the absolute limits of her remaining time on station, and that was assuming she didn't have to use afterburner to evade more missile threats. But she couldn't abandon the captured soldiers now, not when rescue was so close. She dove toward the compound, flying so low that her aircraft's wake turbulence shattered windows in nearby buildings. Her cannon fire walked across the courtyard, carefully placed to force the enemy fighters to take cover while avoiding the prisoners. The psychological effect of a 30-foot airplane screaming overhead at 200 feet was exactly what she had hoped for. The enemy fighters abandoned their attempt to load the prisoners and scattered for cover. But Sarah's low-altitude pass had exposed her to concentrated ground fire from throughout the village. Her aircraft shuddered as heavy machine gun rounds tore through the wings and fuselage. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, and she could smell smoke entering the cockpit. The radio crackled with General Morrison's voice. "Captain Mitchell, this is General Morrison. I'm ordering you to immediately egress from your current position and return to base. Ground forces are en route to handle prisoner recovery." Sarah checked her engine parameters. Both engines were still running, but she was losing hydraulic pressure and her flight controls were becoming increasingly sluggish. She might have one more attack run left in her damaged aircraft, but attempting to return to base was becoming questionable. "General, with respect, I have eyes on 4 American soldiers who will be killed or moved if I leave this area. Ground forces are still 10 minutes out. I can hold this position." "Captain, that is a direct order. Your aircraft is taking damage, and you're no longer effective in your current position." Sarah looked down at the compound one more time. The enemy fighters were regrouping, and she could see them preparing to make another attempt to move the prisoners. In the distance, she could see dust clouds that indicated more enemy reinforcements approaching the village. She made a decision that she knew would end her military career, but which might save 4 lives. "General, I'm declaring aircraft emergency and maintaining position over friendly forces. I have captured American personnel in immediate danger and insufficient fuel to reach base safely anyway." The lie about insufficient fuel came easily. Sarah knew that her damaged aircraft might not make it back to base, but she also knew that her real reason for staying had nothing to do with fuel and everything to do with 4 soldiers who were depending on her. As enemy reinforcements approached the village and her damaged aircraft struggled to maintain altitude, Sarah prepared for what might be her final combat engagement. Below her, 4 American soldiers waited for rescue. Unaware that their salvation depended entirely on one woman's willingness to sacrifice everything for their lives. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley as the rescue team finally approached the village. Sarah had been circling for what felt like hours, her damaged A-10 leaving a trail of smoke and hydraulic fluid. Her left engine was running rough, and she had lost most of her flight control authority. But she had managed to keep the enemy forces pinned down and away from the captured soldiers. Through her fading radio, she heard the voice of the rescue team leader. "Hawk 7, this is Rescue 1. We have visual on your smoke trail. What's the situation on the ground?" Sarah fought to keep her voice steady as her aircraft shuddered through another turn. "Rescue 1. Prisoners are secure in the eastern compound. Grid 42 Sierra 785429. I've been suppressing enemy movement, but you're going to have company. Multiple enemy reinforcement convoys approaching from the north and west." As she spoke, Sarah could see the first of the enemy vehicles cresting a ridge about 2 kilometers from the village. Truck-mounted heavy weapons and what appeared to be at least 100 fighters were racing toward the prisoner compound. The timing couldn't have been worse. The rescue helicopters were still several minutes away from being able to extract the captured soldiers. Sarah made a decision that would either save the rescue mission or end her own life. She turned her crippled aircraft toward the approaching convoy and began her final attack run. "Rescue 1, I'm engaging the northern convoy. Get those soldiers out of there fast." Sarah's remaining Maverick missiles found their targets with devastating precision. The lead trucks exploded in brilliant fireballs, blocking the narrow mountain road and forcing the convoy to halt. Her 30mm cannon swept across the stalled vehicles. But as she pulled up from the attack, her aircraft was met with a wall of return fire. The enemy had been waiting for exactly this moment. Concentrated fire from multiple heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades converged on Sarah's aircraft. She felt the A-10 shudder and lurch as major components were destroyed. Her right engine died with a grinding scream of tortured metal, and her hydraulic systems finally gave out completely. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Hawk 7. I'm hit and losing control. Aircraft is going down." Sarah's voice was calm despite the chaos around her. She had always known this was a possibility, and her training took over even as her world fell apart. Below her, the rescue helicopters were beginning their approach to the compound. She could see rappelling ropes dropping from the aircraft as Special Forces soldiers began their descent toward the captured Americans. The mission was succeeding, but Sarah wouldn't be there to see it completed. Her aircraft was now flying on pure momentum, the controls completely unresponsive. She had perhaps 30 seconds before impact, and she was still flying over the village where civilians might be killed by her crashing aircraft. Using her last few moments of control, Sarah pointed her A-10 toward an empty field beyond the village, away from any structures or people. At Bagram Air Base, the Situation Room watched in stunned silence as Sarah's aircraft disappeared from their screens. General Morrison stood frozen, watching the radar contact that represented Captain Mitchell fade to nothing. Despite the chaos and insubordination of the past hour, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the pilot who had just sacrificed herself to save 4 soldiers she had never met. "Sir," a communications officer called out, "Rescue 1 reports successful extraction of 4 American personnel. All prisoners are alive and en route to medical facilities." General Morrison nodded grimly. The mission had been a success, but the cost was still unknown. Search and rescue teams were already being deployed to look for Captain Mitchell. But everyone in the room understood that surviving the crash of a damaged A-10 was unlikely. What they didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell was tougher than her aircraft. The A-10 hit the ground at nearly 200 miles per hour, cartwheeling across the rocky field in a shower of sparks and debris. The aircraft's titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit did exactly what it was designed to do. It kept the pilot alive through an impact that should have been fatal. Sarah regained consciousness, hanging upside down in her ejection seat, suspended by her safety harness over what remained of her instrument panel. Blood was running down her face from a gash on her forehead, and her left arm felt broken, but she was alive. Around her, the scattered remains of her aircraft were burning, sending thick black smoke into the clear Afghan sky. She managed to release her harness and drop to the ground, immediately pulling out her survival radio. "Any station? Any station. This is Hawk 7. I'm alive and on the ground. Aircraft destroyed, pilot injured but mobile." The response was immediate and came from multiple sources. The rescue helicopters, the Ranger units, and even General Morrison's command post all answered simultaneously, creating a cacophony of relief and urgent questions about her condition and location. Sarah looked around at her surroundings. She had managed to crash land about a kilometer from the village, in a field that provided some cover, but also left her exposed to enemy forces who would undoubtedly be searching for her soon. Her survival training kicked in automatically: assess injuries, inventory equipment, find shelter, and prepare for rescue or evasion. As she began moving toward a rocky outcropping that would provide better concealment, Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected voice. "Captain Mitchell, this is Sergeant Rodriguez, Alpha Team. We were the prisoners you just saved. We're coming to get you." Sarah felt tears she didn't know she had been holding back begin to stream down her face. "Negative, Sergeant. Get yourself and your team to medical facilities. I can wait for regular search and rescue." "Ma'am, with all due respect, you just saved our lives. We're not leaving you out there alone. We have your position, and we're en route." 20 minutes later, Sarah heard the sound of approaching footsteps. 4 soldiers in torn and bloodied uniforms appeared among the rocks, led by a young sergeant with a bandaged head. They were the men she had risked everything to save, and they had come back for her. Sergeant Rodriguez helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her injured arm. "Ma'am, I don't know what you did to get us out of there, but every one of us owes you our lives. Thank you." Sarah looked at the 4 soldiers, young men who would go home to their families because she had chosen to disobey orders and follow her conscience. In that moment, she knew that regardless of what happened to her career, regardless of the court-martial proceedings that would surely follow, she had made the right decision. The rescue helicopter that lifted them out of the field carried not just 5 American service members, but also a story that would eventually reshape how the military thought about individual initiative, moral courage, and the sometimes conflicting demands of duty and conscience. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before a military tribunal, facing charges of disobeying direct orders, engaging in unauthorized combat operations, and violating rules of engagement. The proceedings were closed to the public, but word of her actions had leaked throughout the military community. The captured soldiers testified on her behalf, describing how her actions had saved their lives and prevented their execution by enemy forces. Intelligence officers presented evidence showing that the compound she had attacked was indeed a major staging area for terrorist operations, and that her unauthorized engagement had disrupted attacks planned against multiple coalition bases. General Morrison, despite his initial anger at her insubordination, testified that Captain Mitchell's actions had revealed a massive intelligence failure and potentially saved hundreds of lives. The 4 soldiers she had rescued sat in the front row of the courtroom throughout the proceedings, a silent testament to the consequences of her decision. In the end, the tribunal faced an impossible choice. Captain Mitchell had clearly violated direct orders and broken the chain of command that was fundamental to military discipline. But her actions had also saved American lives and revealed critical intelligence that had been missed by conventional channels. The verdict was unprecedented. Captain Mitchell was found guilty of disobeying orders, but instead of a dishonorable discharge, she was given a formal reprimand and transferred to a training position where her experience could be used to teach other pilots about the complex moral challenges of modern combat. More importantly, her case led to significant changes in military doctrine regarding individual initiative in combat situations, the treatment of intelligence regarding captured personnel, and the procedures for challenging orders that might endanger American lives. Sarah never flew combat missions again, but her story became legendary throughout the Air Force. Young pilots learned about the day when Captain Sarah Mitchell chose conscience over orders, when she risked everything to save 4 soldiers she had never met, and when she proved that sometimes the most important battles are fought not just against the enemy, but against the systems and assumptions that can lead good people to make wrong decisions. The 4 soldiers she saved all returned safely to their families. Sergeant Rodriguez eventually became an officer himself, and he kept a photo of Sarah's crashed A-10 on his desk throughout his career as a reminder that courage sometimes means standing alone against the entire world. Sarah's A-10 was never rebuilt, but pieces of it were recovered and now sit in the Air Force Museum, along with a plaque that reads, "In honor of all who choose conscience over comfort, duty over direction, and courage over compliance." The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell became more than just a tale of individual heroism. It became a reminder that in the complex moral landscape of modern warfare, the most important weapon a soldier can carry is not found in any armory. It is the willingness to do what is right, even when the entire world is telling you that you are wrong.